Blowback was a term the CIA invented in a term of jargon with a lot of other CIA jargon. It was in the original report on the overthrow of the Prime Minister of Iran, Mossadegh, in 1953 for the sake of the British Petroleum Company. We claimed that he was a communist. He wasn't a communist, and it's absurd that he was a communist, but it was really for the sake of British Petroleum, in which the CIA said, there's a good chance we're going to have some blowback from this operation. Blowback does not mean just unintended consequences. It means unforeseen consequences of actions that were kept secret from the American public. Therefore, when the retaliation, which is really all the word means, retaliation, when the retaliation comes, the average citizen has no way to put it in context, to understand what's happening. Hence, you get sort of absurd remarks like our presidents after 9/11, why did they hate us? You wanted to say, you have standing around you people who were responsible for the Afghan operation in the 1980s, the largest clandestine operation we ever carried out, who could easily explain to you why they hate us. I mean, that is Dick Cheney, Colin Powell, Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, all of them know with precision why they hate us. But that's what blowback means. It's now entered the language as a term referring to the unintended consequences of our foreign policy, and particularly the kinds of clandestine operations we've carried out now since 1953 to overthrow other people's governments, to have friendly police forces execute people we want eliminated, to carry on campaigns of state terrorism against populations we dislike, as in, for example, Central America in the 1980s. They go on. I mean, that is most recently, last year, April 2002, in Venezuela against Hugo Chavez. In October of this year, October 2003, in trying to prop up a pro-American government in Bolivia that served American financial interests. It's something we need to learn to live with. It also, in some ways, blowback, I think, has become of interest to Americans because we are, as a country or as a culture, so remarkably insensitive to history, so uninterested in history. The thing that always struck me about 9/11 is that we didn't ask the most obvious of all forensic questions: what were the motives of the suicidal attackers of 9/11? If you'd started to ask what were their motives, you'd instantaneously gotten yourself back into the clandestine operations against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s. You discovered that Osama bin Laden comes from an extremely wealthy Saudi family whom you'd normally encounter on the ski slopes of Gstaad with a blonde-haired girl, or as a house guest of George Bush at Kennebunkport, as George Bush 41, the first one, but that he had good reason to get extremely irritated with us. But we not only often don't know much history, and our news media serve us extremely poorly in that area, but that our government also has a vested interest in ensuring that you don't read that history, because it would bring home the fact that some very high-ranking officials of our government are at least partially responsible for the deaths of 3,000 of their fellow citizens on 9/11/2001 in New York and Washington.
I'd like to ask you to, if this is not disrupting your train of thought, to go back to Bolivia.
Yeah.
And kind of elaborate on that, because see, what's coming to crisis here in California is we're increasingly dependent on natural gas, which has to
Yes.
be procured elsewhere because it's peaked here and in Canada, and so this is.
I'm not a great authority on Bolivia. It's simply to say Bolivia is easily the poorest country in Latin America. It has been systematically exploited for its resources by American multinational corporations for decades. During the Cold War, we covered our traditional imperialist relations with Latin America under the cover of Cold War, in which anybody who protested the way they were being screwed became a communist. But that what happened most recently is an uprising, really, a mobilization, I guess is a more accurate term, of particularly the indigenes, the people of the mountains, the Andean peasants in Cochabamba and places like that, who have been, their lives have gotten worse under the regime of globalization that we've imposed during the 1990s. Globalization being a clever imperialist cover for, in fact, exploitation of these people on terms we dictate. And in October of 2003, these people took to the streets to overthrow a corrupt president who was very much supported by the United States, by the American embassy, and who had pushed through a proposal to ship natural gas out of Bolivia to a Chilean port and ultimately to the American market. This sounds, in theory, University of Chicago Department of Economics theory, it sounds like a good deal. This is mutually beneficial trade. The truth of the matter is the terms were such that the funds from the sale of this gas would go into an extremely wealthy elite within Bolivia, similar to the same kind of elite that you find in Caracas that has been desperately opposed to Hugo Chavez from the moment he was popularly elected. But in this case, in October, as a result of mass demonstrations, the president was forced to go into exile. He now lives in Miami, having looted the central bank en route out of the country.
I wanted to follow on with what you were talking about earlier, namely that you said in your conclusion in the book that the geopolitics of the 21st century are going to be determined by the blowback from the concluding quarter of the last century. Could you talk about that?
Well, yes, I concluded the book that I called Blowback, the subtitle, The Costs and Consequences of American Empire, by saying that the foreign policies of the 21st century would largely be dictated by blowback, by the unintended consequences, retaliation of people on the receiving end, those victimized by our foreign policy, particularly our secret foreign policies, of the Cold War period, the second half of the 20th century, or above all, the last 10 years of the 20th century, i.e. the 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when we still fought to shore up Cold War structures rather than acknowledge that the menace of the Soviet Union had disappeared. It seems to me that we have ample evidence that this blowback continues, that between, say, 1993 and 2001, including 9/11, we had 5 major al-Qaeda attacks globally that resulted in significant loss of life. Since 9/11, down through the HSBC Bank and the British consulate in Istanbul, we've had 17 major al-Qaeda attacks. That's, Secretary Rumsfeld said in his now famous long, hard slog memo of October that we need a metric to tell whether or not we are succeeding in the war against terrorism. I think we have a metric, and the metric is we are not, that the situation is getting palpably worse as a result of our misapplication of military power to a problem like terrorism. And so that I think there is no doubt that the war in Iraq alone will guarantee till the end of time blowback against the United States. That is, now an Iraqi patriot can now say, after the capture of Saddam Hussein, nobody can now accuse me any longer of being a stooge for the Ba'ath Party. I'm just now an Iraqi nationalist, and to the extent that I have my self-respect as a citizen, I need to kill Americans, preferably white males, but I'll take females and any color. That's the name of the game, and we brought it on ourselves. That's blowback, though. It's palpable, and we've got a lot of it. We're generating more of it in places like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, these Central Asian republics that became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. They're ruled by old Communist Party apparatchiks. They are among the most repressive and dictatorial places on earth. Their presidents have all been welcomed into the Oval Office for chats with the boy emperor because we want to put military bases there. But the
And why do we want to put military bases there?
because of fuel, of oil. I mean, that's precisely what we're talking about there. It's not, they were never used in the Afghan war. They wouldn't have been relevant. They're too far away. They're far too far away to ever have been used in Iraq. It is the Caspian Basin that we are beginning to exploit and trying to control it, to build this major pipeline from Baku through some very dangerous and odd parts of the world, Armenia, Georgia, then into the Black Sea. I actually traveled in that part of the world back in 1978 and well remember taking a swim in the Caspian and noticing that slightly oily smell. It was famous. It goes back. That's the world of the Rothschilds and Royal Dutch Shell. Goes back to ancient times. The Zoroastrians, after all, discovered how easily this black fluid around there burned. Its chief use at that time was simply to get rid of sores on camels. That's what and then the Soviet Union never developed it because they preferred to develop their oil in Siberia. So it's only now, I mean, Condoleezza Rice was hired by Chevron as their authority on Kazakhstan. Now, she doesn't know anything about Kazakhstan, but she is a Russian specialist. She worked for them right up until the day she entered the White House. James Baker, the former Secretary of State, as you know, his Baker Botts, his law firm, has a very prominent office in Baku, Azerbaijan. There, he is the honorary head of the Azerbaijani Chamber of Commerce. It reads like a who's who of Republican or Houston politics in America to see the Americans with influential positions in Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, not Tajikistan. It is so backwards, so utterly Stalinist, so totally repressive that we can't even get in there. I mean, we try to be nice to them, but these places are absolute breeding grounds today for Islamic militants, and it's as easily predictable as the case in Afghanistan, where also, it should be remembered, we were enormous supporters of the Taliban right down until the summer of 2001, because, I mean, we had taken Afghanistan off the list of terrorist-sponsoring nations, because what did we want to do? We wanted to build oil and gas pipelines across Afghanistan from the Central Asian republics to the Arabian seaports in Pakistan. And we were more than prepared to work with the Taliban, and we did not particularly care about the way they treated women on fundamentalist, almost medieval grounds. We only cared about that when, after the fact, we needed an excuse for having overthrown them when they went beyond our control.
So if you look at a map of that region,
Yeah.
and knowing that somewhere above 30% of the likely reserves of remaining oil
Yes.
Are in that region, in the Caspian and in the Middle East, and you see these U.S. bases now ringed around that area. Talk about the relationship between control of oil resources and the militaristic empire building.
The Department of Defense now, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Mr. Hone, calls it the Arc of Instability. The Arc of Instability turns out to be just exactly what we used to call the Third World, or most of the Third World, but it is right through the oil lands of the world. There's only one left that we don't control now, and that's Iran. We have either side of it with our conquest of Iraq and our conquest of Afghanistan, and they, as well as our president designating them in a State of the Union message as scheduled for regime change by us, by our armed missionaries, because they're part of the so-called axis of evil, even though the Prime Minister of Iran has a considerably greater electoral authority than our own president does. He actually won an election. He wasn't appointed by anybody. I mean, just to mention that Iran does have a government and that it was put there by the Iranian people. But that, of course, the answer to this, it seems to me, is we've been aware that is to say, our oil policy goes back for decades, in which the two fundamental pillars of our source of oil in the Persian Gulf was Saudi Arabia and Iran. We lost Iran in 1979 because of the unintended consequences of our overthrowing the government of Iran in 1953, because they wished to bring under control for themselves some of their oil assets that were in fact owned and had been ruthlessly exploited by Great Britain since before World War I, in the form of then the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is today British Petroleum. We lost Iran, and we were then reinforced Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, we began to fear we were losing after the first Gulf War, when we made, in my opinion, a serious mistake, but we put 40,000 American troops into Saudi Arabia, allegedly to defend the government of the House of Fahd, an extremely autocratic and somewhat reactionary government, but that this inflamed opinion in Saudi Arabia that why was the government responsible for the protection of the two most sacred sites in Islam being defended by infidels. That's Osama bin Laden's ostensible statement for explanation for his warfare against the United States. In recent times, particularly after we put in a government in the United States made up basically of oil executives, it's the one thing you can say, Cheney, Bush, Condoleezza Rice, these people know something about, or know about it from their own family. I mean, after all, George Bush Sr., in the form of the Zapata Oil Company, drilled the first major well off Kuwait back before Zapata turned into Pennzoil, and George Bush sold out and became a millionaire. These people know at least where the oil is. They don't seem to know much else, but they do know that. They've been planning for a long time to try and ease our way out of Saudi Arabia, because it was fairly predictable that Saudi Arabia is going to turn out something like Iran. There's going to be an explosion there at some point, and it is the largest reserves on earth. The second largest reserves are Iraq, so that on virtually the day of 9/11, you had the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor, Ms. Rice, talking about the need to attack Iraq, even though there was no evidence that they had any involvement whatsoever in the events of 9/11, or were in any sense threatening to us, or were not interested in selling us their oil. I mean, it's a straight market proposition. And the war was decided by the summer of 2002, and a few other things came into play, including the fact that it looked like the Republican Party was going to lose an election. Karl Rove, in almost classic terms, said, when you're as far behind the eight ball as Mr. Bush was on, the looting of pension funds, the corruption of energy companies like Enron, the fact that he didn't have an electoral mandate that was worth a damn, that what do? Well, you go to a foreign war and make the eagle scream, and make people feel their patriotism is online. The Chief of Staff, Mr. Card, said, you'll recall, in September of 2002, when the decision to go to war was already made, you don't roll out new products in August. He was talking about the war with Iraq. We have to start preparing the public for it this fall. I think the important thing, though, about Iraq is that we keep asking, well, what is our exit strategy? We don't have an exit strategy because we don't intend to leave. We intend to be there. We're building 4 major bases as we talk. Really 4 very permanent bases. There probably will end up being at least 6, including this one called Anaconda, about 40, 50 miles north of Baghdad.
And why is that?
It's because Iraq has the second largest source of oil on earth, proven reserves. We expected they were going to be much more readily available than they proved to be, because the damage done to Iraq during the decade of sanctions after the first Gulf War, the bombing that we ourselves have carried out, generalized incompetence, it's not been, the refineries and the pipelines are very decrepit, and also they're quite susceptible to sabotage by Iraqi nationalists today resenting our occupation. Even so, we now, that is to say, the arc of oil extends from the Balkans. The Balkans are important simply because there's a project called the Trans-Balkan Pipeline that would be a way of bringing oil from the Black Sea, from the Caspian, across and to a port in Bulgaria, moving it across the Balkans into the Adriatic and then on to Europe and America without going through the Bosporus and Dardanelles. These are such narrow straits. The Turks restrict oil tankers to 150,000 tons in order to prevent ever a oil crash in those straits. We've been looking for a way out for a long time. The largest base we have built since the Vietnam War, Camp Bondsteel in 1999, built by Kellogg Brown and Root of Halliburton of Houston, and built while Dick Cheney was, in that case, chief executive officer of the company and former Secretary of Defense, knowing full well what he was doing. This base was supposed to be for peacekeeping in Kosovo. Well, talk about a howitzer against an outhouse. I mean, this is considerable more base than you need to do peacekeeping, because it exactly spans. It's down near the Macedonian border. It exactly spans where the Trans-Balkan Pipeline is to go. It's not built yet, but it's certainly planned. We are in the process of building the pipeline from Baku on the Caspian through Georgia. We've, of course, now put our troops in Georgia, too, claiming that we're chasing down al-Qaeda terrorists, but there isn't a soul in Georgia who believes it. And again, it also should be borne in mind, these are places that never would the United States have even thought of touching so long as the Soviet Union was still there. It's with the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991 that this whole trans-Caucasian world opens up and that we begin to exploit it. The Russians don't like it. That our big base at Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, they've opened their first post-Soviet base so far, only 40 miles from there. Kazakhstan still has the famous Cosmodrome in it and places like that. They were former part of the Soviet Union. It's laden with tension, as well as, of course, perpetual anti-Russian revolt going on in Chechnya and Dagestan that are among the bloodiest and most unpleasant wars of national liberation at work today. We are not the only people interested in this oil. The Chinese, which are the fastest growing economy on earth today, have started to build a pipeline across Xinjiang into Kazakhstan to tap that oil going off to Chinese refineries. It seems to me, if you look at American foreign policy in broad terms, since 9/11, there are three root causes of the actions our government has taken. One is oil. It should be understood, by the way, that an elementary conservation program in America would eliminate entirely our dependence on Persian Gulf oil. We have the technology to cut that out right now. In fact, sales of the Chevrolet Suburban, 3 tons, 11 miles a gallon, doubled in the year after 9/11. And that is, we could reduce this, but there are huge interests here, not just the oil industry, the automotive industry, the people who profit from the exploitation of fossil fuels. But it needn't happen. That is, it's not as though it is beyond our ability to basically maintain our mobility as we've become used to it in America, but to reduce radically our requirements for imported oil. The second reason for our foreign policy is the influence of the Likud party in Israel on our government. That is, the right wing of Israeli policy that is terrified of any sources of power that might compete with them, meaning essentially Iraq and Iran, and hence the president has identified both of these as part of the axis of evil. And then third, I think, is the sometimes pundits call it the weapons of mass distraction. That is, the need to re-elect the president and the Republican Party by distracting the public with such now revealed to be red herring as weapons of mass destruction in the hands of terrorists in Iraq and things of this sort that turned out to not be there. I think more broadly, and subsuming all these three, is the politics of American imperialism. That is, of the desire of the United States to maintain hegemony over the rest of the world, in which oil comes into play now not just because of our insatiable appetite for fossil fuels, but also as a way of controlling and making subordinate to us nations that could conceivably compete with us because of their dependency on petroleum. This means, above all, in East Asia, most obviously China, which is, as I say, the fastest growing economy on Earth today, with growing needs for fossil fuels in an almost exponential manner. And that's the real problem, I think, is the way in which the American public has been sold on the idea that we are a new version of the Roman Empire, that we can do as we please, we are beyond good and evil, we do not require international law, the United Nations, friends, the old Roman statement about it doesn't matter whether they love us so long as they fear us. That seems to be a pretty good statement of Bush the Younger's foreign policy. But at the heart of it certainly is a determination by very powerful economic interests in the United States, as well as the military-industrial complex, since the military runs off of oil, that they must control as many sources of petroleum as they can, and to also build in the if-then answer to what happens if Saudi Arabia should emerge out from under our orbit. I would want to say on this, I don't personally believe that it's possible to maintain an industrial economy of our sort without having friendly relations with Saudi Arabia. That there is a lot of oil in Iraq. There is a fair amount of oil in the Caspian Basin. There is oil in the Gulf of Guinea on the west coast of Africa. There's, of course, oil in Venezuela and oil in Indonesia. But none of it adds up to the quality of oil in Saudi Arabia and the fact that Saudi Arabia is the only place on earth that can make a living by selling oil at a very low, i.e. well under $20 a barrel price. All these other places, I mean, the problem with Central Asian oil, it's totally landlocked. And it's extremely difficult to get it out. You either have to go through civil war countries, or through Afghanistan, or through Iran, or something like that. And the price goes off the chart pretty fast. Saudi Arabia is one of the few places that can supply huge amounts of petroleum at prices that both serve the consumer's interests and the Saudi government. Therefore, I personally believe that our policies are likely to produce a revolution in Saudi Arabia, and that the rebels are almost surely going to be anti-American. And when that happens, the United States probably starts to turn into a Rust Belt.
China. Just the other day, there was a natural gas well explosion in rural China, in an area that apparently is experiencing a boom, if I can put it that way, because of the net.
Yeah.
So
in both senses of the term, yes.
So can you comment on that? And you're saying that part of our strategy is to control the oil in order to deny it to other people as well as to use it ourselves. How does that play into China relations?
I don't think our desire to control oil necessarily means to deny it to others. It means to use leverage over them, to ensure that they understand that we could deny it to them, given our influence. China has been a focus of the neoconservatives who are writing foreign policy for the United States in this administration for a very long time. They would like to see it as the replacement for the Soviet Union. It is a country 4 times larger than this is, the United States. It is very highly educated. It is the fastest growing economy on earth today. I guarantee you everyone listening to this program is sitting in underwear made in China. I mean, that's where it's made. That it's a huge source of investment by the Fortune 500. That the Chinese well understand that they are much more concerned with the Vice President for International Affairs of Boeing Aircraft Company than they are of the Vice President of the United States in terms of their relations with the United States. The Chinese are not obviously going to develop in exactly the same pattern we did. If China were industrialized to the level of Japan in 1960, it would probably absorb all known petroleum on Earth. It's that big a potential economy. So it's the same way, for example, China is today almost surely the largest user of wireless telephones of any place on Earth, because the wireless telephone is perfect for them. They buy them above all from South Korea. They work with Samsung and they develop the best around, because they're never going to have the structure of landlines that we do in this country that makes it not absolutely necessary in the United States to use a cell phone in order to communicate. You can pick up a traditional phone and it works better than a cell phone. The Chinese are extremely sensitive to their energy, the fact that they are net energy importers now. There is some oil in China, in the Daqing fields in Manchuria, but certainly not enough for what's happening there. At the same time, China, one of the most defeating things of our foreign policy is that China is now turning in exactly the direction that we've wanted them to for all of these years. They're probably the most materialist country on earth today. That they are enthusiasts for getting rich. I don't mean to tell an anecdote, but my goddaughter, who is a Brazilian woman, is a flight attendant for Continental Airlines. She's been on furlough since 9/11. She's living in Shanghai these days, studying Chinese at my strong encouragement. She absolutely loves rich Shanghai and knows nothing about Mao Zedong and the history of the Chinese Revolution, or could care less. China is a rich and expanding place. It is, moreover, enormously connected to American manufacturing. I mean, that we manufacture everything on earth today can be manufactured in China cheaper than it can anywhere else, including a Boeing 747, most of which are made in a People's Liberation Army plant in Xi'an, China, and assembled in Everett, Washington. It's where they come from. The neocons in our government tend to regard China as a growing threat simply because it is going to be inevitably a superpower. This is, to a certain extent, the fundamental question of the 21st century. Can we adjust any more intelligently to a legitimate growth of wealth in China than, for example, Great Britain and France did to the growth of wealth in Germany, Japan, and Russia during the 20th century that led to unimaginably savage wars? On the evidence we get from Washington, D.C. today, the answer would have to be no, that we seem already to be identifying the Chinese as a growing threat to us, even though commercially we are deeply interconnected with them and have a huge stake in this relationship, and they seem to love it, and that they have a Communist Party who has just now, after the last party Congress, admitted millionaires into the Politburo. I mean, that is, this is Deng Xiaoping's, I don't care whether the cat is black or white so long as it catches mice. This is a way of saying I don't care whether it's red or anything else. If he catches mice, that's a good cat. And that's China today. It's probably actually the most capitalist country on earth, much more so even than we are. But this does pose, I think that's the implication of your question, this poses major problems of adjustment, understanding, and compensation to the legitimate expectations the Chinese should have as they emerge on the scene as by far the most important nation in East Asia, and as having at least a legitimate right to make some rules for that part of the world, much as we do under things like the Monroe Doctrine in the United States, over all of Latin America. The Chinese, I don't think, are particularly imperialist. They seem utterly committed to the world of commerce. But we're the ones who seem terrified of the thought, how do we adjust to rich Chinese? I do not myself believe that there's in any sense China should be a threat to us, but that the great danger is that we will make them a threat to us. A war with China would be a rerun of the Vietnam War. We would lose it, certainly, but it would radicalize China, bring to power among the most dangerous elements in the Chinese military, and inflame Chinese nationalism. It would bankrupt the United States. It would very logically, given our mindset, lead to the use of nuclear weapons, because we would not be able to compete in conventional military means, and the war would be fought on the Chinese mainland. It would be a rerun of Vietnam. We would lose it. We would divide Japan into almost hopeless situation. The Japanese can't remain our allies and recall their legacy of war crimes in China during World War II. It is a very, very loaded issue in Japan. There is no alternative but peaceful coexistence with China, but our people don't seem to know that, and they're not having that. Leadership is not offering them ways in which peaceful coexistence should work out. Both sides have an unbelievable interest in control of the climate, control of resources, in that China is easily going to turn out to be the second most important source of gases that produce global warming. We are obviously the first. But as China further industrializes, and particularly its most important source of energy is coal, they are a major source of greenhouse gases, and we need to cooperate in controlling this. So far, we've instead had a record of hostility, except that after 9/11, the Chinese have decided to adjust to our so-called war on terrorism and to give themselves a little bit more time. But there is no doubt that the world of the John Boltons and Richard Pearls and the sort of intellectuals behind the neoconservative movement that has hijacked our foreign policy, that China has been in their target since since the demise of the Soviet Union. The evidence was the issue in the spring of 2001, when we sent an espionage plane into South China to test their defenses. They set up 2 fighter planes. One, in a collision with our plane, was knocked down. We claimed that this was just innocent flight. It was we have a 200-mile zone out at sea that we defend against any kind of an aircraft intruding. The case was resolved fairly quickly by the Chinese offering a pro forma apology. They couldn't do it instantaneously because it would have produced a nationalistic reaction in China. It would have been overwhelming. But yes, China is the issue for the future, even more so than the Middle East.
Let me ask you then, so what's the relationship of what you call, or borrowing from Galbraith, that you call the military-petroleum complex?
Yes.
And the project for the new American century? You seem to have different agendas.
Oh, I think the project for the new American century and the military-petroleum complex are, to a very large extent, the same thing. They come to the same conclusion, but from different calculations. The military-petroleum complex that Professor Galbraith refers to means basically realist foreign policy, and the argument that resources and resource diplomacy lie at the very heart of all foreign policy. The great error in it is that our profligate use of these resources tends to destroy our case. That is, the symbol of the United States after 9/11 was of some jerk driving down a California freeway in a 3-ton SUV, getting 10 miles to the gallon with an American flag attached to his radio antenna. This was absurd. That is, the the thing that happened on 9/11 was to bring home to us the need for crash conservation of limited fossil fuels, and that we have the technology to do that right now. We could, that it's, any number of people have calculated you could totally eliminate our dependency on the Persian Gulf by simply producing genuinely fuel-efficient engines right now and moving, as for example, Toyota has been investing enormously in the post-petroleum automobile. Our so-called market-driven, competition-driven companies are instead just relying on buying politicians to keep the petroleum economy going as long as possible. Whereas the project for the New American Century instead has an ideology that began to emerge with the demise of the Soviet Union. The original ideas were written down by Paul Wolfowitz when he was an official of the Department of Defense when Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense in the last George H.W. Bush administration. At that time, the statement that we intended to maintain military dominance over the rest of the world, and the first signs of commitment to a preventative war strategy. Preventative war is a polite word for aggression. I mean, for what the Germans did to the Poles on September 1st, 1939. It's a euphemism for taking somebody out before they could possibly get in your way. These ideas were suppressed in 1992 but with the return to power of the younger Bush, these people came into force, particularly in the Department of Defense, but throughout the government, basically. In fact, one of the great contrasts between the two Bush administrations is the level of prudence in the first one. That is, George Bush Sr.'s national security advisor was Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft. Now, I have no particular admiration for Scowcroft as an intellectual, but he was a prudent general. He lived in the Cold War, and he always knew if we made a mistake, the Soviet Union would take advantage of it. The Soviet Union would take advantage of our mistake. I mean, one way or another. We took advantage of their mistakes. Therefore, he was cautious. All of these people who founded the project for the New American Century were present in the government, in the Reagan and Bush administrations, but they were never given the kind of authority they've been given under this younger president and with a national security advisor who simply doesn't know what she's doing. I mean, she's an authority on a country that disappeared, the Soviet Union, and she's in over her depth. But their ideology is more one of being mesmerized by the apparent power of the United States. That is the belief that we are literally beyond any constraints. It is, I think, worth remembering here that all of them, to a man, as General Anthony Zinni, the General Franks' predecessor as the CENTCOM commander, a Marine Corps general, as he characterized them, chicken hawks. I mean, he's very resentful of them because he was not just a veteran of Vietnam, but he was wounded in Vietnam. He said, these are people that have no experience either of military life or of war. And this is a view that is very widely held throughout the high command today, that we are ruled by serious amateurs in these matters. But nonetheless, these people began to develop an ideology of global dominance that led to September 2002, the issuing by George Bush administration of the so-called national security policy of the United States, which calls for preventive war. The president and the vice president between them have named between 50 and 60 nations that they believe deserve a regime change via our armed missionaries, the U.S. military. One of the things that, the most elementary thing you can say about preventive war, if you're ever going to try to justify it at all, your intelligence has to be impeccable. You have to really know that they were about to kill you, and that therefore you are in some ways justified in moving first to prevent them. What has now been revealed is, of course, the intelligence was all diddled, invented. It was propaganda that led to our war in Iraq, and that our intelligence community is largely discredited today. I myself still cannot imagine how a president of the United States can, in his most authoritative statement, the State of the Union address to Congress and the people every January, state something that was at that time known to be false, namely that Iraq was trying to buy uranium in Niger, known to be false by the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Director of Central Intelligence keeps his job. If he keeps his job, that strongly suggests not that he failed to tell the president, but that the president told him what to say. That's the only reason he'd still be there. And these add up to scandals of huge constitutional proportions. But the point, I think, of your question is that the military-industrial complex, the professional armed forces, the growing militarism of our country, on the one hand, comes together with these ideologues for American empire, for the United States as the successor to the British Empire, the kind of propaganda we've been seeing throughout 2003, arguing that we are a good empire, a different kind of empire, a benevolent empire, et cetera, et cetera. Both of these ideas come together, they converge to produce a determination to use military power in an unsanctioned, illegitimate way throughout the world, wherever it crosses our minds to do so. The almost certain result is that quietly the rest of the world, sort of like the rest of the world in the 2nd century AD, begins to think of ways to combine against us. That the Department of Defense is quite candid in saying there's only 2 ways you can possibly resist the power of the United States today. One is through nuclear weapons. The other is what they call, typical Pentagon jargon, asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare means terrorism. This policy has probably been the greatest single boon to nuclear proliferation that has ever come along. I mean, in that everybody now recognizes what was wrong with Saddam Hussein was that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Had he had them, we would have held off, just as we're not invading North Korea because we have good reason to believe they have them and they have the way to deliver them. If I were Lula da Silva sitting in Brazil today, I would be saying to my advisors quietly and assuredly not in the presence of the New York Times, the only way you can stop the American juggernaut is with nuclear weapons, or at least to have them worry that maybe you have them. Brazil had a halfway well-developed program toward nuclear weapons 20 years ago. They abandoned it in favor of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Today, the treaty is more or less destroyed by our unilateralism and causing everybody on earth to think a la Pakistan, a la India, etc. The one thing that causes the Americans to wake up and get prudent again is to think we might be able to take a few. I mean, Churchill in 1940, at the time when it looked like the Nazis were going to invade England, said rather publicly, if you've got to go, take one with you. That's, I think, Kim Jong-il in North Korea right now. He's saying this president has announced that he's going to take us out. He says so in the State of the Union message. He's now demonstrated his willingness to do this without any form of legal sanction, violating international law right and left, invading Iraq and decimating the place. Under these circumstances, my fellow North Korean citizens, if we have to go, we're going to take with us the city of Seoul, as many bases as we can in Okinawa, and as many Japanese as we can get. Now that's where these policies, as well as the fact, of course, that in the process of all this, we've more or less savaged and dismantled 50 years of structures that we as a nation have worked at to try and produce international law and international understanding among nations of diverse cultures, in which we recognize the diversity rather than, as the president has said, we need to basically enforce our values on them too. I mean, the line, if you're not with me, you're against me, that reverberates in the South United States. That's from Matthew. Jesus Christ said that. those who are not with me are against me. There are a good many Christians who know where that line comes from, and it's a very dangerous line for a president of the United States to be using as a matter of public policy.